I recently finished a book about the life of Harriet Tubman. In my view, one of America's greatest heroes. Born in the early 1800s into slavery, she not only attained freedom for herself, but had the courage to make a dozen trips back into slaveholding territory to rescue her family and friends, and then went on to be a scout and spy for Union forces during the Civil War, and then even established a home for the elderly near the end of her life. In my view, she's an exemplar of what personal bravery can yield in the face of overwhelming odds. My wife and I had the holiday off for Juneteenth, and we decided to take off the Friday as well to give ourselves a long weekend to go on a little trip. We packed up the bike and set off on Thursday afternoon from our place in Washington, D.C., headed for the eastern shore of Maryland and Delaware to enjoy some camping and track down some of the locations from Harriet Tubman's early life.
Hello, little friend. Hello.
As we set off on a very hot, humid afternoon, we realized there was a fairly sizable storm front not too far behind us. But looking at the radar and judging the speed it was moving, we figured we could at least outrun it to the place where we were headed. So we set off through the surface streets to get out of town and onto US 50 headed east through Maryland and into Delaware.
Already so sweaty.
When we got to the Bay Bridge, there was a fair amount of traffic, which gave us some time to have a decent look at the gathering clouds behind us. We were a little worried about getting stuck on the bridge across the Chesapeake in the middle of a storm, naturally, but the clouds seemed to be moving slow enough, and traffic seemed to be easing enough that we'd be okay. We made our way over the bridge, and then other than some gusty wind that pushed us around, we were fine. After hammering it down the road a little bit further on the eastern shore, we ended up stopping for gas. At this point, clouds were definitely getting closer and more ominous, and we were wondering whether we wanted to wait it out at this gas station or just head for the finish line. Ultimately, we decided we'd rather just risk it, so we got back on 50 and headed for 404, which would take us over to the town of Georgetown, Delaware, which was close to our campsite for the night.
Good. Well, say some prayers.
By the time we got to Georgetown, the front was really right on top of us, so we parked the bike, threw the cover on top, and dashed into a local Mexican restaurant just as the drops really started to fall. We ended up holed up at this little place called Maudie's for about an hour and a half while the worst of it passed. There were still some isolated pockets of the storm moving through, but we found a little spot in between them where we'd have enough time to get out to our campsite.
Bless.
We went back out to the bike, rolled up the cover, and got on our way to Redmond State Forest where we were staying for the night. We arrived at our site just about as the rain was starting again, so we pulled into the site and immediately threw the tent up and tossed everything inside as fast as we could to keep things dry. After a bit of a mad scramble, all the stuff was inside the tent. It was warm and muggy, but it was fairly dry. In the morning, we got up, made some tea, and leisurely packed our things up before heading out to the first stop of the day, the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Historical Park. park is near where Tubman would have grown up and spent much of her early life. The park grounds have a variety of native plants, and they show a kind of concentrated display of the landscapes you can find in the area. It has sweet gum, cattails, and lots of little ponds with dragonflies and bees flying everywhere. Inside the museum, there's a few short exhibits that cover Tubman's life and escape from slavery. The experience is fairly short. You can get through it and probably read all of the stuff in about a half hour, and it's very nicely done. An artist has created some small brass renditions of elements from major points in Tubman's life that accompany the larger displays. For the unfamiliar, it's probably worth explaining here a bit about Tubman's life. She was born Araminta Ross here on the eastern shore of Maryland in March of 1822. She and her family were enslaved and worked on farming, timbering, and trapping at several different farms in the area. In 1849, she ran away to freedom in Philadelphia, but soon returned to guide members of her own family and others away too. Over the coming years, she made roughly a dozen trips and brought around 70 slaves away from bondage to freedom in the North. After the Fugitive Slave Act was passed in 1850, she also helped runaway slaves move further north to New York and Canada where they would be safer. She also helped John Brown plan his 1859 raid on Harper's Ferry, and then during the Civil War, she was a scout and spy for the Union. For her part in the 1863 raid on Comby Ferry that rescued some 700 slaves, she's even credited as the first woman to lead a military expedition inside the United States. After the war, she worked as a suffragist and an advocate for the elderly, ultimately helping establish a care home for them. After heading out from the museum, we didn't go very far before stopping again. Just a mile or so away is a spot where the road crosses the Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge. It's not necessarily one of the waterways Harriet Tubman would have worked along, but it does give you a sense of the riparian landscape that made up the area where she grew up. Tubman was notably strong for a woman of her size, and sometimes worked alongside men in timbering operations in the area, which would have seen her mingle with both free and enslaved black boat operators that plied the inland waters of Dorchester County. These connections often helped local enslaved families get news and learn more about their surroundings, which was something that could aid in their escapes. From there, we went a little further up the road, only another mile or so, to the spot of the Brodus farm, the place where Tubman would have spent her childhood years. The house currently on the land where the old farmhouse would have stood is still privately owned, so you can really only read the plaques at the side of the road in the same space. But still, as with any kind of historical road trip, sometimes part of the fun is just knowing that you're standing in the same spot that a hero had stood in before, just kind of taking the same air and trees and views that they would have, give or take. The late, great Tony Horwitz probably best described the extreme version of this sensation in his 1998 book Confederates in the Attic, where he detailed his experiences with reenactors of Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. They describe a kind of time travel high that hardcore reenactors experience, a sort of period rush. Not really so much of that for us here, standing in a field, somewhat more reflective, but still, it's a quiet understanding that the fields around us were formative places for somebody who would become an American hero later in their life is an interesting experience. The next stop on our little tour was also very formative for Harriet Tubman. At some point in the 1830s, when she was around 12, she had been hired out to another farmer in Bucktown, which was just up the road. She happened to be in the general store when there was an altercation between an overseer and another local enslaved man who had left work without permission and gone to the store. The man fled from the overseer, who lobbed a 2-pound weight at the fleeing slave. The weight did not find its mark, but instead struck Tubman in the head. It took her months to recover from the worst of her injury, but it also left her with severe headaches and hypersomnia for the rest of her life. After the incident, she also began to have visions and dreams, which she interpreted as coming from God. Tubman's unshakable faith is a really core aspect of her life, as she likely attended Methodist services with their family as a young child, and her faith that God would protect her while leading her fellow enslaved family and friends to freedom likely steeled her will as she undertook daring rescues that put her at huge risk. After seeing the general store, it was about time for lunch, so we headed to Cambridge, which is the closest large town, up on the banks of the Choptank River on its way to the Chesapeake Bay. We stopped at a brewery for lunch, which was okay. We got some crab cake sandwiches and a beer and sat in the air conditioning for a while. Honestly, I think with how hot it was, the climate control was probably the best part of the stop. At this hour, it was still a little early to be going straight to camp, so we decided to stop at 2 more little historical places. First was the Linchester Mill, a grist mill that was constructed sometime in the 1840s, though various sawmill and water-powered machines had operated in the space since the 1680s. The mill, along with its general store and post office, provided a place where free and enslaved African Americans would have worked and mingled together, offering opportunities for information and support to get to those seeking their freedom. There were several stops on the Underground Railroad near the mill, so places where families would risk life and limb to hide, protect, and support slaves that were seeking their freedom in Philadelphia or further north. Many of these were Quakers, but Harriet Tubman's own parents, Ben and Rit Ross, also operated not too far from the mill over on Poplar Neck. Just up the road from here, a few miles on, was our last historical stop of the day, the James Webb Cabin. James Webb was a free black man who built this cabin from local materials in 1852 and lived there with his wife and 4 children, all of whom were enslaved. By the laws of the time, children born to an enslaved woman were also the property of the slaveholder, even if the father was free. The house is a typical example of what many African American families would have lived in during the time, and also what poorer white families would have lived in the early and mid-19th century. It's fairly rare to see a simple house made of local rustic materials to have survived this long, so it makes it an interesting little time capsule to see. By this point, the sun was getting a little low on the horizon, so it was time to head for camp for the night, about 35 miles away, back in Delaware, at Trap Pond.
It's a beautiful day for it. We left yesterday and we got absolutely rained on, so today's been very nice.
Normally, I try to avoid state parks and go for state forests or national forests instead, but I figured we'd want to be able to take a shower at least, so we decided we could stomach the sound of people quote-unquote camping with their generators running their air conditioning in their RVs for one night. At camp, we set up our tent, tried to get a fire going. The firewood we got from the front office was fairly damp, so it was a bit of a struggle to get the fire going, but we did eventually get a respectable small one going to enjoy as we had some beers and cooked some noodles on the camp stove. In the morning, it was time to head back home, but not without a few stops on the way. Some friends of ours had minded our cat while we were gone, so we wanted to bring them something from one of the many little produce stands that dot the sides of the road here on the Eastern Shore.
Yeah, sure. Try to get it off. Ready? Yeah, don't forget.
We stopped at one on the way, grabbing some local honey and some jalapeno relish for them, and a few peaches for ourselves to eat on the bench outside before carrying on.
Alright, ready? Oh, ready. Time to go get roasted. That's a f***ing stop sign.
By the time we got to the Bay Bridge, it was basically lunchtime again, so we decided to yet again stop at our favorite crab place, Wild Country, in Annapolis. It was a bit busy when we got there, so we did have to wait, but it's no bother. We were on our vacation, and we had nowhere to be, really.
I'll forget.
After a bit, we had our crab cakes, and as always, they were worth the wait.
Good there, homie? Yeah, we good? That person backing up towards us, and I was like,
From there, it was only an hour's ride home, so we were basically at the very end. But there was one last stop I wanted to make, just a stone's throw from our house. Lincoln's Cottage. Here in Northwest DC is where Abraham Lincoln often came with his family in the hot summers to get away from the rat's nest of Capitol Hill and the White House. It's also where he wrote the first draft of the Emancipation Proclamation, at a desk just inside the window here. After seeing all these places from Harriet Tubman's life, it seemed fitting to stop here and see the place where a document that took such a significant step towards ending slavery was written. Lincoln was a man who understood and abhorred the moral abomination of slavery, but he was also a political moderate. He wanted to avoid radical action when possible. This isn't to take away from his contribution at all, obviously. The proclamation and his promotion of the 13th Amendment, not to mention being commander-in-chief of the Union Army, were, of course, key in the road to freedom for enslaved Americans. But while those in power needed to move incrementally to wipe away one of these darkest stains on the tapestry of American history, it's people like Tubman who took matters into their own hands to guide the enslaved to freedom, who were just as important to the struggle for liberty.